Good evening, my name is Phil Goddard and welcome to Bourne Environmental Review on December 11th, 2024. We're going to have a special guest tonight talk about the Joint Base Cape Cod Natural Resources Program, specifically on Camp Edwards, overseen by the Mass Army National Guard. And for those of you that don't know, if you look at a map, the town of Sandwich and Bourne, Mashpee and Falmouth circle the base, but I'm looking predominantly at Bourne and Sandwich, are really confined to these thin strips around the perimeter of the base. And growing up around here, you're not really aware what's out there, but when you get up in a helicopter and you look, or you look on an aerial now, we have Google Earth or whatever, it's really easy to see this. There's 22,000 acres of the military base, 15,000 of which are the northern portion we're going to really focus on here today. The bottom part is called the cantonment area, where all the hardware is, the runways, the housing, but we're going to focus on the 15,000 acres in the northern part of the base. And I have a very special guest here that oversees that area, Jake McCumber, who is the Natural Resources and Training Lands Manager for the Massachusetts Army National Guard. Welcome, Jake.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
And we were talking before the show, you come from Wyoming.
Yep, that's where I grew up.
And completely different world. You have counties that are bigger than Massachusetts, right. I would imagine, right? So I call that big sky country.
It is indeed.
I've never been up there, been to the Southwest. It's an area I want to go up to, is, just spectacular mountains, and then there's prairies and the diverse, you don't have the ocean, no?
Right.
In Massachusetts, surprisingly, is very diverse for a small little state. We've got mountains, the Berkshires, and you can go pretty quickly out within an hour, within 2 hours in our state, and see just about everything.
Right.
And then certainly within New England, get up to Mount Washington, which is some of the coldest areas in the country, the highest winds. It's got some real unique ecosystems. But right here in Cape Cod, shockingly, you may not know the diversity of wildlife that we have right here. And I really wanted to focus on this because it's unique habitat, and you'll explain why and how we got here. And it's a critically important area for us for watershed in our water supply, which has been codified in state law, and we'll talk about that. Yeah. And it's also an active military base with a long history that we all know about, and those of you that have watched the show over the years, and it's hard to believe I've been doing this show for 28 years in January.
Excellent.
I had hair, and I'm on the cleanup team out there, as folks, the regular viewers know, and it's pretty much about a $2 billion cleanup between the cantonment area where all the hardware was, and the runways, and the garages, and pipe spills, and an old dump, and then you've got the military training with the Army with the range firing shells down into the basin of a glacial moraine, which was great to have the observation post looking down, okay, 3 degrees, the azimuth this, but of course all the water drains right into the middle of the basin, where then it perches and it radiates out all the towns. So you couldn't have had a worse location for a range in terms of water supply. But hydrogeology is a relatively new science, within the last 50 years or so, and we know better now, which now we're dealing with the complications of cleaning that up, getting the unexploded ordnance, while you're managing the wildlife and training. So what is your, we talked about your title, what is your role? What are the main points that you look at every day? What are you trying to do out there?
Right, well, I'll start in with one of the biggest secrets, unfortunately, of Department of Defense is the conservation mission that we have. And so when we're doing the public base tours, which really introduce Camp Edwards to a lot of the public or other presentations, I always lead in with that success that we have throughout the country on these defense lands, because most people have a view of what military training looks like, and it's usually not what it really looks like on the ground, where these bases are protecting large swaths of land so that the soldiers can train out there, and that's all managed for conservation through partnerships.
Do you have a sense, DoD-wide, how many hundreds of thousands of acres between all the military bases worldwide? Let's just say the continental United States. How many acres do you think?
Oh, I don't actually have a good sense of that, but some of the active duty Army installations are over 500,000 acres out west, for instance, so immense lands that play a huge role in recovering endangered species and other things like that. So that's the exciting part of my job is to be a part of that. And most people, even locally, don't even know about it, but that I have a whole conservation team focused at Camp Edwards.
Get into that for that very reason.
Right. And so that day to day, it's somewhat varied for me, but I'm that program manager for our conservation program. So my title's a natural resources and training lands manager because I've got funding both from the conservation side and the training lands side, which is more focused on training the soldiers through landscape management, but those blend in really nicely together. So,
is your purview the entire 22,000 acres, or just the
15,000 of
just
Camp
15?
Edwards?
Who manages the wildlife in the down, in the southern 7,000?
So the other services have counterparts
Really?
for me, actually. So there's Space Force has a natural resources and
I did not know
environmental
that.
person. Air National Guard has environmental staff, including natural resources, and Coast Guard does as well. So again, throughout the Department of Defense and with Coast Guard Homeland Security, there's natural resources conservation built into everything. And the selfish part of that, amazingly, is that they learned through World War II and Korea that we had to manage and conserve training lands or we would lose them. And we need to be able to train all the generations of soldiers to come as long as there's a
That's right.
United States military.
Every base, every acre is valuable for training, and we've had a process this area is familiar with called the Base Realignment and Closure process, where Congress looks at defunding and closing military bases, installations such as the South Weymouth Naval Air Station is a great example. Joint Base Cape Cod was named Joint Base Cape Cod, even though it's not a true joint base.
Right.
Governor Patrick named it that to appeal to the folks, powers that be at Congress, to talk about the joint missions out there, which there are a number of tenants, you've already mentioned them, including the USDA
Right.
and the National Cemetery, of course. But that is an example of we came together to keep the missions going. It was a fighter base, of course, the 102nd Fighter Wing, the F-15s, which,
Right.
interesting, again, this is politics. They moved 100 miles west, which in F-15 flying time is about 5 seconds, but that whole active F-15 wing moved, and then it became an intelligence wing.
Right.
Distributed intelligence, I think it's called, something of ground intelligence, something like that. They review all the intelligence from drones and other things around the world. Right here is a National Guard unit, and so that mission, keeping that here, was vitally important, and keeping the Army training here and preserving it, but having to do it in a manner that did not compromise our groundwater and water supply, which goes back to the designation of what you manage. Tell us about the designation the state put on that area.
Yeah, so they classified it as the Upper Cape Water Supply Reserve, and that's state legislation that provides really robust protection for protection of the groundwater, protection of wildlife habitat, and compatible soldier training. And so right there built into our state regulations is that conservation part of our mission as well. So not only do we have the Federal Sykes Act, which mandates defense conservation, we have the Water Supply Reserve protections, which build in wildlife habitat protection. And the way you protect wildlife habitat is through active conservation management. So studying the resources, understanding the species that are there and their needs, and then managing for the diversity. You mentioned diversity a couple times earlier, and that's a huge focus for us, making sure that we have a very healthy ecosystem here on the Upper Cape. And that 22,000 acres of Joint Base Cape Cod is about 10% of the entirety of Cape Cod. So
Isn't that
it's
amazing?
really important.
That's why I say when you look at an aerial, we're really squeezed out to the edges along 28
Right.
and then Sandwich Road and the Mid-Cape Highway, and you look up at an aerial and you're just stunned that there's this big hole, if you will,
Right.
which is fascinating. And I'll share that over the years I've flown with the Army National Guard in Hueys. I wish I had gone up in a Black Hawk, but I've gone up and gone out and gotten footage for shows over the years. And I was absolutely flabbergasted. This is probably 20 years ago, 25 years ago maybe. I had no idea what a fire-adapted habitat and scrub oak out there looked like. It reminded me of Eastern Oregon, out in the prairie, just as far as you could see practically, very low-lying brush, nothing like around the base perimeter, and I had no idea that I was there. And I had taken a tour with Colonel Dadek, who was the commander of Camp Edwards. This is probably, again, late 90s, and we drove around. I was just stunned. I was like shocked. And how did it? What was that? What was I looking at then, and how has it changed in the interim, and why?
Well, that transition's fascinating. So if we look at the historic aerial imagery, like if people are interested in that, can look at the Cape Cod Commission's website. They have a chronology viewer, they call it. It's got a slider.
Do they do? Oh, excellent.
Where you can go back and forth with different time frames of images on the left and right and look at that change over time. So you can see what the base cantonment looked like in 1952 compared to what it looks like today, and see that dramatic change, because there used to be 43,000 soldiers there during World War II. It was extremely active.
I know that because my father was inducted into the Army Air Corps in 1940, October, under that initial draft, right down here.
Wow, amazing.
And when he was inducted and brought in, they were rapidly going from 0 to 50,000 troops.
Right.
And what's interesting historically, from the architectural perspective, is the barrack design that they used with the little overhangs, 2 levels of them, was the model that they used for all of World War II around the country, right?
They wrote the manual on
amazing?
how to build Army barracks at Camp Edwards. Yeah.
There was something crazy. I've heard stories that there was so many people working on it, and troops coming in, gearing up at 40, 41, 42, obviously. There's a great website and an organization called the Cape Cod Military Museum. My classmate from Hanover High School, Joe Yukna, and Jerry Ellis, they run it, support it. He does great presentations on the training that occurred out there during World War II, including the amphibious command, the D-Day landings. They trained on Cape Cod, down at Wacoit, Falmouth, and Mara Vista, the islands. And it has changed rapidly. So, but that prairie-like atmosphere was not, that was, how did that occur?
So before it became Camp Edwards, the state classified it as wasteland. You can actually go back and look at the State Forest Commission reports from the early 1900s. Like there's a great one from 1914 that has a couple images of Bourne specifically, including Pine Hill, because it was that formal wasteland designation, because it was all scrub oak as far as you could see.
Which is very low.
Right, so it was low, very frequently burned. There were fires from the Woods Hole Railroad all the time. People were burning for gypsy moth control and all sorts of different things, but half of the fires at that time were just classified as boys in the State Forest Commission reports.
Oh, boys.
Right, like just out lighting fires.
Yep. Mischievous boys.
Yep. And so it was low scrub oak, almost no trees anywhere you could see on the landscape, and all the historic photos from back then show that same either scrub oak or pastoral farm landscape.
And 12,000 acres, right?
So they gave it to the Army because nobody else wanted that expanse of scrub oak. And now we know that the scrub oak shrublands is one of the rarest natural communities in the region and supports a huge diversity of rare species. So the Army, through the training with the artillery and the mortars that you mentioned earlier, were keeping fire on that landscape when they took over, which turns out to have saved one of the last remaining pine barrens remnants in the Northeast.
Coast,
right. Yeah. And so the North Atlantic coastal pine barrens ecoregion extends from New Jersey through eastern Massachusetts.
Cape May, right?
Yes, that's included in it. And
I say that because I was in the Coast Guard. That's where I went to boot camp.
Excellent.
Right down there.
Nice.
And I remember that's a big birding area.
Right.
But there's just very few of these areas, and that's called fire adapted habitat, right?
It is, yes. So
if
evolved
we went back
with fire.
1,000 years ago, was it all regular taller pine trees, or did the indigenous Wampanoag also burn there too?
They also burned as well. So there's historic records from the 1600s. I think it was Thomas Morton wrote about the Wampanoags using fire as a management tool so that they could keep healthy blueberries in
Great.
their habitat, walk to hunt for deer and things of that nature. They were maintaining with that same tool that we use today.
Interesting.
Because the pine barrens evolved with fire. They records looking back at charcoal in mud and things like that show that the pine barrens here burned probably every 6 to 9 years, something on that order.
Amazing.
So very frequent.
And that created a very unique series of species
Right.
for flora and fauna that you couldn't get anywhere else.
Right, because it was all built on that fire. And things like the scrub oak and the blueberries, wild indigo, most of our plants here.
What is wild indigo?
It's a bushy, bright green plant that actually, if you bruise it, it turns this deep purpley blue color.
It's not used in making indigo ink, is it?
No,
Okay.
nor for dyeing jeans, but they actually used it as a pore substitute.
Ah, gotcha.
It didn't have the staying power of real like indigo dye, but all those plants, they evolve with fire. When you burn them, they're much healthier. Blueberry won't put on fruit if you don't burn it occasionally and things
Don't
like
some
that. So.
seed cones need fire to open?
Yep, serotinous cones it's called, where they're held together with
What
sap.
kind of cones?
So serotinous.
Serotinous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And our pitch pines don't have serotinous cones, but the New Jersey pine barrens, some of them do. So if you don't have fire, they won't open
They
and
won't
spread
open.
their seeds.
Isn't that fascinating?
It is.
So that's 15,000 acres that has a long history of fire and is adapted. Then came World War II and massive influx of training,
Right.
massive influx of artilleries and firing and small arms fire and mortars into Korea, into Vietnam. I remember as a kid down here, the convoys would come over the Bourne Bridge, the MPs would set up and they would block traffic and they would just wave them on down. And like for 10 minutes, the convoys would be coming, and then the trains would come, and we'd put pennies on the track, and the trains would come down Mo Beach, and 1, 2, would be counting the car, 43, 44,
Wow.
45, and just ding, ding,
Yep.
and all that activity. However, very little understanding of environmental stewardship.
Right.
And that's not just the military, it was everywhere.
Right.
Open dump burning. Town of Bourne had an open dump. Every town had an open dump, and often they would burn all sorts of stuff there, and they didn't know where to site them. So you take that plus the fact that even into the 90s, they were taking leftover propellant bags and had chemicals in them, and they would put them in a pit and light them on fire, and then it would rain and would leach into the ground,
Right.
and unexploded ordnance. So we have this 80-year history of explosives going out there, not all of them exploding,
Right.
and other intensive uses, including human waste and other wastes that were buried all over the place from various training exercises. And it was under exigent circumstances, if you want to say, in World War II, because we had the world to save, and it was like,
Right.
get it done. And a lot of corners were cut from an environmental perspective that we wouldn't do today. But again,
Right.
back then they didn't know as much either. But you take all that cumulatively, and then the Air Force was the first focus of the cleanup of the groundwater pollution and the plumes, and back in the day, the Army side up on the northern part, I would say the Army was a little more reluctant to get into it. I'll be generous, okay? And there were a lot of activists that said, look, there's a lot of stuff out there, and there was a lot of resistance from the DoD and the Army
Right.
side, and I kept saying to them, look, you can't go around the public. You're not going to expand anything out there.
Right.
You're not going to get what you want unless you go through the public. We're
Right.
too knowledgeable here. We're right down the street from Woods Hole. We have a lot of smart people that understand
Right.
science, groundwater science. And under Superfund was the southern part, but the northern part was under Safe Drinking Water Act. The EPA came in and said, shut it all down.
Right.
So we don't have the kind of training we have anymore.
Right.
We don't have the artillery. There's still training. Explain how the training evolved over time to the fact that we're allowed to even have anything out there.
Right. So it came through that partnership and understanding of working with the public to get where we're at. And by embracing that, now we have what Colonel Porter refers to as a culture of conservation
Colonel
with the
Porter
culture
is?
of training. Colonel Porter is the base operations manager for Camp Edwards. So I've been here for over 12 years now, and my whole time is seeing that leadership emphasis on working with the public and working with the conservation to make sure that we can have that success and carry that training forward into the future, because embracing the conservation part of it gives us that foundation of sustainability. And that's where the regulations really help us too, even, which is what people understand now, is that environmental regulations help us do what we need to do for mixed land use.
Well, it's not just a nice thing to do. Let's be candid. If you didn't do them, you wouldn't get the training.
Right.
And it was mandated, and there's an Environmental Management Commission, which is comprised of 3 commissioners, which are Fish and Wildlife, DEP, and
DCR, correct.
Department of Conservation and Recreation.
Right.
So you're talking the senior commissioner level oversees a series of environmental principles, stewardship principles, and training principles that are codified. So all the troops that come in are all educated.
Right.
There's drip pans underneath the equipment for the oil. You know, the latrines are over here. This is how you bivouac, which is the camping. There's, you know, pack in, pack out. You can't like sit out there with your Doritos bag and, oh, that was great. You're like, what do I use? Throw it in the woods. There's a whole series of things that are extremely stringent.
Right. They are. They're very stringent. But that we know what the rules are because we have those environmental performance standards. They're called under Chapter 47. So that we understand well what needs to happen for sustainable and compatible soldier training in the groundwater reserve
that have known nothing else but those standards.
Right. And it's you know, culture is constantly changing too. There's an anecdote that I really love where about 3 years ago, I think it was, we had a combined arms exercise on the base. So there were many different Army National Guard training units all working together like they would overseas because they need to train on their individual unit tasks and get proficient on that. But when they go overseas, they have to work together. So infantry working with logistics, working with military police, all working in together. And so we do that occasionally on the base, and we'll have thousands of soldiers there. And usually leadership comes down. And so one day the adjutant general, who's in charge of the Massachusetts National Guard, was down with other officers. And they talked to a young logistics officer who was in charge of a convoy, and he was telling them that he had stopped his entire convoy because he saw a box turtle crossing the road, and that he stopped and moved the box turtle across the road to a safe spot. And it's like, a couple generations ago, a soldier would not have been willing to tell the head of the National Guard that he had stopped his convoy in his training.
And I'm sure that the adjutant appreciated that. I hope he did, because
he did.
He has to answer to the governor, who has to answer to the public about why we even have this base.
Right.
And with that base realignment closure, if we didn't do these things and were not providing a vital mission support, of course, but doing them in a manner that created more problems, it would be easy for the state and the government to shut it down.
Right.
So we would not have that. And then without that, that would be a major economic impact to the Upper Cape community.
Right.
And that is another reason why we have to work in harmony between the training, and you kind of manage both. You've got the conservation and the training mission to make sure that you can do what you want, what the Guard needs to do. And I'm sure there's sometimes friction points that say, you can't do it this way, you got to do it this way, and it's like the eyes are rolling. But I think of, you know, the boomer era and the Gen X folks, you know, they're all retiring and aging out. So you're dealing with you know, a young soldier is going to be 20 years, 22 years old. They've never known anything else but that.
Right.
So the attitude's probably completely different.
Right. It is different, and people just see that it works here. And there's that, again, that leadership emphasis on this is how we're going to do it. It makes us better, so that even when we get new folks coming in, regardless of, you know, what culture they grew up in, they know that that's what we're going to do, and that it makes us strong, so that we can. That we're at.
So you said you have a staff,
today.
right? So how many staff do you have?
I have 7 people on my team on the natural resources conservation,
that's
and
amazing.
that's part of what makes these Department of Defense installations so special, is that we need that conservation to support the soldier training, and so we're able to invest in it like many properties aren't. So we're out there, we're doing the resource monitoring, we're doing the active habitat management. We're doing the permitting to make sure that we have
Full-time-
sustainable
full-time
projects.
job.
It is, yeah. It keeps us very
And you
busy
get out
with
there
that
and
many
walking
people.
around, you get in shape too, I
Yeah,
imagine.
yeah.
That's amazing. And you're a wildlife biologist? What's your background?
Yeah, I started out in wildlife biology. I went to the University of Wyoming and studied wildlife conservation and management, and then I worked for the U.S. Forest Service for a while, which was a really great experience learning mixed land use right off the bat, and that really became my passion. How do we take an important piece of conservation land but meet all of these different needs in a way that builds
Extremely
sustainability?
challenging and rewarding too at the same
Right.
time, I would
And
imagine.
it requires building stakeholder collaboration, building partnerships, bringing everybody together so that we can focus what are our goals and how are we going to do this together so that everybody can get the best that they need and focus on that sustainability.
I've said this before, and I've told the leadership at the highest levels, this base is a exemplar for DOD, and I'm hoping that what we do here is resonating and reverberating amongst the other branches and around the DOT, is it?
It does, yes.
Okay.
It does.
So they pay attention to what we've done here.
Yeah.
They listen, although there are still mistakes that I'm pretty shocked at some of the basic mistakes that are still made within the DOD, such as fuel depots and storage tanks near water supply on Hawaii. That is, still a problem. And how is that happening? And nobody's understanding that the tanks can leak into the water supply in 2024. It's just really, Navy. Come on. I mean, this is. Call someone down here on Cape Cod that understands these issues. Or the other one is, so we've got that one, and then there was another one I couldn't remember at the moment, but there was also other mistakes that have been made still. We want to make sure we learn from those lessons that we've learned down here, because they were hard won, hard fought, and they were very controversial.
Right.
And you had folks that were like, you're just crazy, wacky environmentalist liberals. You don't understand the mission. And okay, but on the other hand, you're contaminating drinking water supplies that we get from the area. So the idea that it's sort of they cannot be compatible is not necessarily true.
Right.
And we need to pay attention to that. So I'm encouraged to hear that those conversations are occurring at that level. What is the award, though, that you just got? Explain to that, because that's
was exciting.
At the highest level, yeah.
So the Northeast region of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service awarded us as the Northeast Military Conservation Partner of the Year at Camp Edwards, and that was based on the collaboration that we prioritize to meet our conservation needs. So we're constantly working across many different agencies to meet that mission, prioritizing federal at-risk species, Massachusetts endangered species, and building those plans so that we can not only be training the soldiers but have the healthiest pine barrens possible. So we had folks come from Washington, D.C. to your question about whether at DOD they see what we're doing and see that success and build that into the mission across the country. They absolutely do. We had the Assistant Secretary of the Army here when we got that award from the Northeast Region of Fish and Wildlife Service. So that was a nice pat on the back for us and
U.S.
what
Fish
we're
and
doing
Wildlife.
here. Yes.
Right. And that is extremely gratifying to hear, certainly for you and your staff and the Army Guard and overall the National Guard for Massachusetts, but for the public too, because we've heard that there are still some emotional wounds from decades of being told we're sovereign immunity, you can't touch us, we're the federal government, go away, you're anti-military. And the reality is that there were some very, very serious things, and it actually wasn't even until 1992 was the Federal Facilities Act, or close to the name of it, but we're finally environmental regulations were applied to the federal facilities. What's
Right.
the Federal Facilities Installation Act or something like that? What was it?
Yeah, I don't-
Something like that. But it applied, basically before then it was, yeah, sovereign immunity. Your environmental laws don't apply to us. It's national defense, go away.
Right.
You're asking too many questions. And we were an Air Force base back in the 60s, 70s, and there were Constellation aircraft flying 24 hours a day, every 4 hours, and they were dumping fuel at the runway. And that's one of the plumes.
Right.
And there's a long history of sort of don't ask too many questions, get the mission done.
Right.
And that mentality has changed. So it's great,
It has.
great to see in this now being recognized. And that was for the diversity of wildlife that you manage here, the methods by which you're doing it, and so
Right.
forth. So we're going to talk about one of those
Yeah.
methods, which I've seen the change where we talked about 20 odd years ago, flying over it, that there was scrub oak, very low, looked like a prairie. I was shocked. But then in the last 20 odd years, since the halt of artillery fire and the exploration and investigations around unexploded ordnance, you didn't have the fire out there.
Right.
I mean, a lot of the taller pine trees, as a white pine or other types, they just started growing in there, filling all that in, looking
Right.
like everybody else,
Yeah.
everywhere else. Do I have that right? Basically, I mean, the central impact area looks completely different now than it did.
The very central part of the impact area is still kind of open scrub oak, but it's been creeping in from
Right.
the edges. So in the, starting in the 50s, that's when all the trees on the Cape basically started growing back in, including the base. The fires on the base kept that out for a while longer, but you can see it moving into these areas. And so the prescribed fire, now we use that fire as a conservation tool, and we're actively out there. We're burning about 400 acres per year on Camp Edwards.
So now we've had this big investigation where they've done magnetometry to detect the metal, and if you haven't taken the tour with Sean Cody and the staff that does the public awareness and outreach on the Army National Guard website, just go to Joint Base Cape Cod, Google that, or go to mmr.org, even though that's the old Massachusetts Military Reservation. You'll find Camp Edwards on there, and they've got tours,
Right.
which are like a 4-hour tour. It's absolutely incredible to go
Yeah.
the whole base and what they're doing out there, and the programs, and you can see firsthand all the ordnance they found out there, and they're cleaning up, and they're gridding it off and clearing it. And so once they've cleared, is the plan to go back and fully burn that down and maintain it down? So now are you checking off these quadrants and saying this 10 square mile area or 1 square mile area, whatever it is, now is clear of UXO, and we could go unexploded ordnance is UXO. We can go in there and maintain that with fire.
Right, that is our long-term hope, is
Right.
Once that's safer for firefighters doing ground ignition, that we can actually get fire back into that scrub oak barrens. In the meantime, their restoration work, it's pretty amazing because they build the conservation into it as well, and they're leaving a lot of the root material from the scrub oak and things like that there. So within a couple years, it's green and vigorous growth out there and supporting the buck moths and other various
But
species.
we're clearing areas that forever are going to be cleared of the ordinance. That we can
Correct.
go in now, aggressively get it back to where it was because we've
Right.
been standoffish for 20
Right.
years during the cleanup.
Yep.
And so eventually, as we get around, and there will be a day when we've done that, which is they've thousands and thousands of rounds, and they've what percent are they clearing that area? 75%, 50%? Do you think?
Oh, they're aiming to get above 90% clear in everywhere they
Within
go.
what time frame?
Oh, I'm not really sure.
Okay. It's not 20 years.
No, it's a long term.
But
Yeah.
what I'm getting at is it's not like it's 20 years before they have gone through the entire area. They're moving pretty far along on
Yeah, they're
that.
doing 10 to 15 acres a year of removal. Yeah.
So we've talked about the various areas out there. What are the species? Let's take a look at some pictures, and we'll just walk through some of the area out there. So this is kind of a current present day
Right.
that we're looking at here. Where are we on the base?
That's along what's called the moraine, that glacial ridge.
What's a moraine?
a moraine is the ridge of rocks and sand left when the glaciers created Cape Cod. So the highest point on Cape Cod is on the base at about 308 feet. This is just north of that. This is from what's called Observation Point 10.
We're looking
just
south
on the,
or north? Or?
We're looking to the east here. So out across the very eastern part of Bourne and western Sandwich. This is a restored Pine Barrens area where we've actually gone in with some forestry and prescribed burn to restore that.
So this is what you want it to look like.
Right.
The area further east is denser. That's not what you want it to look like.
Right. Well, we want that diversity that we talked about before. So we want areas that have close canopy forests, but with these broad shrubland openings, areas of savanna. Because when fires burned through here thousands of years ago, it would have been patchy on the landscape.
Okay, so you may do it a little differently than it had been done, where it was just completely
right.
scalded, if you will.
Yeah, because part of the success that we're seeing, getting that award and everything else, is that when we're out there doing, like we've done bird surveys on the base since 1994. And so we can look really closely at population trends for all these different species. And forested birds like the scarlet tanager and black and white warbler that are declining at 8% a year, some of them, throughout their ranges, we're seeing those forested birds increase as well on the base, but also the shrubland specialists that are extremely rare, like the whippoorwill and the prairie warbler, they're increasing on the base as well. So we're focusing on that diversity so that we can carry all those species forward together.
Fantastic. Right? So let's keep going through some pictures. We have a picture of some of those species you're talking about. All right, so this is more, this is post.
Right, this is also post-treatment. This is an area that we restored several years ago where it was a wildfire scar from a 1986 wildfire that had killed most of the trees except the largest pitch pine and just left scrub oak in its wake, more or less. But when I started here, that area was 12-foot tall scrub oak and very little was able to use it. And so we restored that site, we followed up with fire, and within a couple of years, it had species like the Barron's buck moth, which is state listed. It's one of
restored it how? You planted seedlings?
We literally mowed the scrub oak with an excavator.
You didn't want.
We do want the scrub oak, but we want the scrub oak to be like it's fire maintained, where it's low and patchy with plants
so it's pretty
in between
aggressive
the brush.
Management techniques in some cases.
Yeah, so this was an excavator with a large forestry head that was more or less mowing the lawn in all of that scrub oak.
So this is the result of that. This is what you want to see. This mixture out here.
Right, because this is the diversity. You see the patchy colors out there. That
cool.
means a lot of different plants are growing in there, which support all the. We have 20 state-listed species of moth, for instance.
Oh my gosh. So we have some other photos. Let's go to the next one. And this is
that same site, but when we're actively burning it. So this is the same location as that last photo, while we're using that prescribed fire as that natural management tool. Bringing the fire back into the Pine Barrens. And this site now, if you do a walk out there in October, you'll probably see 20 to 50 buck moths flying, which are very rare. It's full of prairie warblers. It's the highest density of
prairie warblers in Massachusetts. It just seems like an oxymoron.
It's a poorly named bird.
Right, because we don't have a lot of prairie in Massachusetts. I've been out in Illinois, and it's beautiful out there.
They actually like young forest habitat, open shrubland habitat.
Well, see the plume of smoke, and we've seen them around here because you do advertise that you're doing prescribed burns.
Right.
And especially around here on this part, we've seen the plumes come up, and they're pretty spectacular. And awe-inspiring. And so, folks that may not know what's going on, that's what's going on. It's not out of control. I'm sure you get some phone calls. There's a fire in the base.
We get a couple, but actually we do so much
people figure it out
notification, and we've been doing it for so long now. We've been actively doing prescribed fire there. I should say we loosely, because they've been doing it since the late 80s.
Well, and this now is a little peek behind the curtain for folks, and that's why I wanted to have you on. Let's go to the next slide. Isn't it a great shot? Right,
so that's, again, actively burning out there. The fire can look kind of dramatic and flashy, but we have, it takes years of planning to put a prescribed fire on the ground, because we need to go out there and understand what the fuels are, which when you're talking about wildland fire, fuels are the vegetation that you're actively burning. So we need to have management objectives. What's it look like now? What do we want it to look like? How can we use the fire behavior and weather conditions
And you're creating
to
some
get
fire
those
breaks
results?
too, I would
Right.
imagine.
Yep, and so you can actually see what we call a soft fire break kind of in the middle of that photo, where we went in lightly with heavy equipment and opened up a fire break so we can manage that prescribed burn, and then we just let that go back into the vegetation. And that again creates some structural diversity out there, so some different species will use that mowed strip that also burned.
Because you don't want, God forbid, in uncontrolled circumstances to go across into the towns.
Right. Yeah, and so the fire ultimately, beyond the conservation stuff, a lot of what it's doing in these pine barrens is protecting the communities. We're using the fire to reduce
Use the
the
fuel
fire
up
hazard.
in a controlled manner, right?
Right.
Let's go to the next slide. What is this?
That's the Barron's buck moth. So that's a species I've mentioned a couple times
Endangered
now.
species?
This is listed in Massachusetts under the Endangered Species Act. They're actually, scientists are just finding that this species is actually like 5 or 6 different species, and there's a particularly rare one in our Massachusetts pine barrens.
So this is not invasive, it's native.
It's native, it's good. This is a silk moth, it's
And what do moths do in the ecosystem?
one of the important roles they play is food. For the eastern whippoorwill, which is also a state listed species that we're particularly known for at Camp Edwards, it's almost its entire diet is moderate sized moths like the buck moth.
So it's the chain of life, if you will, the food chain. Next slide.
And that's the eastern whippoorwill right there.
Where is it? I can't see it. It's right in the middle there. It's
right in the
camouflaged
very
so
middle.
well.
You can see it's looking towards the top left of the image. Incredible camouflage. They nest on the ground.
I mean, it looks like lichen on a rock or something. Right?
Yeah, really neat bird. People that grew up in the eastern United States mostly grew up listening to whippoorwills. There's so many songs.
Can you give us a sample of their call?
I can.
Okay.
Whippoorwill, whippoorwill.
Okay.
So they're named.
I know Bob White, and then there's Phoebe.
Right. Yeah.
Next slide, please.
And that's the New England cottontail. That's another species that we're very well known for. Camp Edwards played a outsized role in trying to keep that species off the endangered species list. They were a candidate for federal listing by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we were part of a large partnership collaborative to use habitat restoration to try to restore New England cottontail populations and keep them off the endangered species list.
Well, those are the pictures we have, kind of good overview of some of the
Right.
work that you're doing and the species you're protecting. Coyotes are everywhere now. Are they on the base going after the bunnies?
They are, yep. And we see sort of classic population dynamics that you get in intro to wildlife courses in college and stuff when fishers moved on.
That is, we have one more.
Yep, that's a spotted turtle, so a very different habitat. They're in some of this sort of swampy, boggy areas on the base. They're
under endangered or listed or threatened?
They're being evaluated for federal listing right now.
But eastern box turtles are
state listed. Yeah.
State listed,
Yep.
not endangered, but they're species of special concern or something.
Right. Yep.
So turtle, I love turtles. The turtles all over the place. So I think that was our last slide. So we can go back to our 2A here. It's just amazing the diversity you're talking about that most of us have no idea that are out there. There's some ponds, there's kettle ponds, which are created by the remaining chunks of ice pushing down all over Cape Cod. Donnelly Pond is near the Bourne landfill. That creates all sorts of opportunities, and it's really, really fascinating to see. It's encouraging to see that they're compatible with the training. And I'll tell another story. This is probably 10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. There was a massive, massive training exercise. You might recall this. Yeah. And this was for like 2 weeks. And we had the general adjutant or folks coming down, and hundreds of troops, maybe thousands, actors, mock villages, and they used air explosives pneumatics rather than real explosive.
Right.
To do because of the concerns. And I remember speaking to the regional director of DEP, Southeast Regional Office at the time, and she was kind of emotional in a way, not in a way, but she was emotional because on the one hand, it was her job to enforce the cleanup and the master contingency plan, and along with the federal folks as well, but that we had the ability to do the mission too, and that very rapidly in sort of look the long history, relatively rapidly,
Right.
Massachusetts, the Army and Air National Guard have pivoted to take care of this base because they
Right.
know how critical it is, not just for Massachusetts, all of New England. There are troops
Right.
that come here from all over New England, around the country too, I would imagine.
Yep.
All sorts of missions. You got fixed wing, rotary wing, the Coast Guard out there, which covers from Canada down to New Jersey,
Right.
which is astounding when you think about it, that
Yeah.
that one base is so critical to District 1 in the United States Coast Guard. And she was a little emotional because that training exercise would have been unimaginable
Right.
just 10 years earlier, when there were massive plumes all over Falmouth and Bourne and Sandwich and Mashpee, huge decisions, records of decisions
Right.
about how we're going to treat these plumes, where in the neighborhoods we're going to go, what may be able to go to the ocean and be dissipated. There's not an unlimited amount of money. You have to make some tough choices. You're in the communities dealing with neighbors, with wells and agreements and Tyvek suits, and
Right.
it could be scary if you don't know
Yeah.
what's going on. And that's how I got involved, because in Katomet, this is probably 1996, there was a drill crew out there in playground area, and it was right out of ET. We were
Oh,
cordoning
wow.
off the playground when they had white Tyvek suits on, drilling, and nobody, what is going on?
Yeah.
Is there nuclear waste out there? And you can imagine if you don't know
Right.
anything about this, and suddenly someone shows up and you can't go over there, and am I
Wow.
going to die if I go over there? What happens when you leave? And to the credit of the Air National Guard and then the big Air Force who brought in AFC at the time, Air
Right.
Force Center for Environmental Excellence, which is Air Force Civil and Engineering Center now. They got a public information program in the Army as well. And I think our community is probably among the most well-informed and educated military communities in the country, I would
Right.
say, with regard to environmental stewardship. I like to think.
Right.
Because we've been through the ringer.
Right.
The books have been written about this. Billions of dollars has been spent nationally. Precedential decisions have been made. Technologies have been developed here that have been
Right.
deployed, such as automatic, or I should say remote-controlled excavators with
Right.
magnetometers on there, and sifting techniques. And how do you go at a base and find unexploded ordnance? How do you do it
Right.
safely?
They've
And
had to learn how to do
right?
that. Yeah.
Amazing, because there are hundreds of bases around the world.
Right. Yeah. I think one of our biggest challenges is still getting people to understand the tremendous success that's grown out of that because of the necessity to write all of that, to be able to meet our mission. Incredible successes have come out of it, for conservation, for the groundwater, for everything else.
So let's talk, I'll just briefly comment on the bridges. And I remember going to a meeting about 5 years ago. Surprisingly, shockingly, I have a little different perspective because of my history I've explained. But people are saying, let's build a third bridge, we'll go through the base.
Right.
And I just kind of roll my eyes because, number one, what are you going to do with the third bridge in the middle of February or this time of year when you don't have the traffic? You have 3 bridges to maintain, which
Right.
is just inordinately expensive. It doesn't make any economic sense. In August, when the traffic's bad, oh, third bridge, let's go. But it would go through the Camp Edwards, which
Right.
would countermand the agreement that we just talked about.
Right.
And it would effectively kill the training program for Camp Edwards for the military, for the Army, which then without Camp Edwards, then the base goes way down on the list of priority for
Right.
DOD, for funding, it could impact the Air Guard side. And it could, next round of closures, yeah, you're just not worth it anymore. We're
Right.
going to close the whole thing and divvy it up, and we're going to put a shopping mall out there and housing and whatever.
Right.
And we'll talk about that in a second. And so that, however, was the plan, people may not know, in the early 60s. It was called the South Side Connector.
Huh.
That was going to come over the Bourne Bridge and cut through the base to Mid-Cape Highway
Oh, wow.
and bypass Sandwich Road. In fact, on the northbound lane of 28, there's a barrier of trees on the east side between the landfill and the highway,
Yeah.
all up and down the corridor there on 28. That was a paper highway for a new northbound lane.
Oh, wow.
The current northbound was going to be the southbound, and the current southbound was going to be local. And then the bridge was going to dump into a South Side Connector. From a logical highway engineering perspective, it's perfect. In fact, on the other side, when they were building 495 down to 25 to connect to the Cape in the 60s, they just drew a straight line from here to here. Sounds good, let's go. And
Yep.
engineering, and back in the day, that's how decisions were made that have scarred communities,
Right.
such as the Central Artery in Boston, where they just tore through neighborhoods, cut off the water from Boston, and the Big Dig rectified a lot of that.
Right.
But that was classic way that the government did things back then. Big engineering projects down in the Everglades in Florida.
Right.
They channelized things, and they thought they could control the Everglades, and they realized that they were doing massive damage.
Right.
The filtering system is so important to the wildlife. The swamp, and there is a giant, slow-moving river, and they're having to undo with billions of dollars worth of work all the damage they did in the 60s, because we're going to engineer everything. And a woman, the Garland family, said, no, we're not going to have you run your highway through our farm,
Right.
and we're going to fight it. And it went into the court for decades, for like 25 years, and it created the modern Environmental Protection Act, MEPA, Massachusetts Environmental Protection Act, and the Environmental Impact Reports, and they changed the route where 25 connects to the Bourne Bridge. So you ever notice,
Oh, wow,
if you look
yeah.
on a map, so you're from Wyoming, you don't know this story, but it kind of goes in this circuitous, roundabout way, and you're coming around an extra, because of that lawsuit, and because of the damage we would have done potentially to Buttermilk Bay,
Wow.
the runoff, the farm. So environmental activism can make a difference. It's made a huge difference on the base. But it's led to I think a hybrid approach now that we have to do in the modern world. There's so much encroachment, so many issues. Right now, coming up, I just saw an RFP, request for proposals, from MassDev, which is the quasi-state agency tasked by the legislature to look at divestiture of military property, like they did at Fort Devens, like they did at South Weymouth Naval Air Station, how that process would unfold to go and develop and reuse that land once the military mission is over. Now, we're looking at that now for a contractor to help MassDev look at a master plan, because we are desperately in need of housing on the base, and we're desperately in need of other services. Yet we have an active duty mission out there.
Right.
And so it's now, how can we integrate all this together? I know the Upper Cape communities, in my world of solid waste, we're looking at composting operation. We're talking about siting one out there with you, but it's got to fit the mission. It's got to
Right.
be supported by, not interfere with the mission. And there's a possibility for military housing, which is desperately needing, as well as affordable and other housing, workforce housing for families. But I'm sure this is on a major list, on your major item on your list to,
Right.
oh boy, here it comes. What areas are they going to want? How's it going to affect your plan, right?
Right. It is high profile, and that's where, again, building those stakeholder groups to make sure that everybody understands what are the important things to be considering and prioritizing here. There are very few landscape scale remnant habitats left in Massachusetts, quite frankly. And we're lucky that basically from Miles Standish State Forest down through the woods of Falmouth is more or less contiguous conservation land. And so I think, that'll be on the priority list. Master planning is a wonderful thing because you can bring those stakeholders together. And again, that mixed land use planning, there's so many other needs. How do we meet these needs
And we've been squeezed
together?
to the periphery
Right.
that maybe had the base never been developed, that would have all look completely different.
Oh,
It
yes,
could look
yeah.
like Rockland and Weymouth and everything.
Right.
We could have a highway going through there.
Right.
But we've the unique set of circumstances in history in the Upper Cape. It's such a fascinating part of New England and the country, I believe, for a variety of reasons we've
It is.
discussed. So we have to tread carefully. There's a lot of voices that are Cape Cod Commission, Association for Preservation of Cape Cod, the Air National Guard, the Army National Guard, the conservation commissions in the area. So you and your counterparts at the other commands have a huge, huge challenge
Right.
to sort through all of this.
Right.
And there's some land that's going to be divested. I'm sure that's going to happen because there's a lot of acreage out there and some opportunities.
Right.
But how do we move forward?
Right. And again,
that's
move
gonna be-
forward together. So
move
that-
forward together. So I think it's really forced in a positive way, sometimes with a lot of banging on the doors to get to there, a point where we have that dialogue. And recently there's been a lot of attention on what training should be done out there, and there's been rulings on that. So, but that was all part of a process.
Right.
Right? And so now we're at a situation where that has been settled, at least for now, that we know any expansion of the training is at least on hold for now. But I'm sure you were involved heavily in that. So these are discussions that are critically important. One may have this opinion, one may have that opinion, but I think it's fair to say that this is a much more open process than it was even 20 years ago, 25 years ago.
Right.
And that's something to be proud of for the Upper Cape community. So what's a place to get more information? The Cape Cod Commission, but where can we go? Do you have a website you can mention?
Well, as you mentioned before, if people look up Joint Base Cape Cod and go to that website, there's links to the Environmental and Readiness Center website for Camp Edwards, and so all of our documents are there. We really encourage people to look for what's called the Annual State of the Reservation Report, which is a name that harkens back to when it was the Massachusetts Military Reservation. But if there's been a hint of anything that interested people in this, all of our research and monitoring projects are described in there. We put a lot of data
and there's information on tours that are typically in the summer.
Right, those
and
get
I
advertised on
recommend
the
that folks
website.
pay attention. There's advertising. You can sign up for those tours. It's probably a 3-4 hour commitment, but it is an amazing peek behind the scenes out there. Jake, can't thank you enough. This has been fascinating. I hope you enjoyed it at home. My name is Phil Goddard. I wish you a wonderful holiday season and Happy New Year in 2025. Take care.